Hello, Hey Boomer community. My name is Wendy Green. I am your host for Hey Boomer. And Hey Boomer is a show for people who will soon transition or who have already transitioned to retirement, and they're asking the question, what's next? And in our show, we explore many topics. This month, we're focusing on the topic of money and how our perception of it and how our lifestyle is impacted by it and how our relationship with money impacts the choices that we make. And so the goal of Hey Boomer is to have our listeners leave inspired that this next chapter of life can continue to be a fulfilling and meaningful chapter of life. My guest today is Ryan Frederick, and Ryan focuses on the intersection of place and healthy aging. He recently released his first book, Right Place, Right Time, The Ultimate Guide to Choosing a Home for the Second Half of Life. And it has already become an Amazon new release bestseller. Ryan is CEO of Smart Living 360, which helps institutions and individuals thrive in the age of longevity by providing strategy consulting services, real estate development services, and consumer content. Some of Ryan's clients range from leading health systems to billion-dollar institutional investment firms to national real estate developers and senior living providers. And I hope that you all took the free assessment tool at smartliving360.com. If you haven't taken it yet, quick, go over to Smart Living 360 and take it so that you are more involved and with our discussion today. So it's on smartliving360.com. Ryan is a graduate of Princeton University and the Stanford Business School. He lives in Austin, Texas with his wife and 3 teenagers. But before I bring Ryan on, I want to give you some never too old stories. So our first story is about Frank Stiefel. Frank is a 72-year-old filmmaker who made his first film at the age of 62, and he won an Academy Award for his second film at the age of 70. His first film, Ingalore, is a documentary about his deaf, Holocaust-surviving mother. His second film, Heaven is a Traffic Jam on the 405, is the one that won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Short Film. Frank says, I grew up with a voice in my head that told me every dream was too hard, too out of reach, and too impossible. I found that the way to shut the voice was to try. And once I proved I could reach further than I imagined, I kept on reaching and dreaming bigger. And every success built on the one before. And these projects, these dreams became my life. How's that for a mindset? Just try, even if it seems like it's too hard or too far out of reach. For my second story, since we're going to be talking about housing, I decided to look into one of the most famous U.S. architects, Frank Lloyd Wright. And at the age of 22, Frank Lloyd Wright built his first house where he experimented with geometric shapes and volume as he built on to accommodate his growing family. But his most famous house, Falling Water, was built when Wright was 69 years old. 7 years later, when he was 76, he received a request to design a building to house the Solomon R. Guggenheim collection of paintings. It took 16 years to complete that museum. During that time, he continued to travel extensively, lecture widely, and write prolifically. He was still involved in all aspects of work, including the ongoing Guggenheim project well into his 90s. When he died, he was 2 months shy of 92 years old. So finding purpose, doing work you love, and having a mindset to try, we are never too old for those things. let me bring Ryan on. Hey, Ryan.
Hey, Wendy. Thanks. I love those stories. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, I love sharing those new stories every week. Yeah, it's fun. So just to kind of set the tone, I wanted to say that, as boomers, when we looked at how our grandparents aged, right? Well, first, they were old. And typically, they either lived in the home that they were in, they may have moved in with the family, or in the saddest case, a lot of times we saw them aging in what appeared to be a pretty grim nursing home kind of place. But their lifespan was so much shorter than our lifespan now. And, I'm approaching 69. I don't look at myself as old, although when my grandmother was 69, she was definitely old. So just to kind of put it all in perspective, as we're talking about place. And I wanted to also say, hope everybody has taken the assessment. I took the assessment and found it fascinating and very insightful. So you focused on a lot of aspects, not just the home that we're in. And I wonder if you could give us a high-level overview of the things that we need to be considering, and we'll dig into them more as we go on.
Yeah, for sure. I want to address one of your earlier points, and that is we're living in this age of longevity, and I'm a Gen Xer, and my mom is a silent generation. My dad, just a couple of years younger, is a baby boomer. My my grandparents were the greatest generation. And I spent a fair amount of time with them. We didn't live close by, but they would come visit in the summers. I on a couple occasions, I spent time with my maternal grandparents in Florida. And to your point, when I think about their mindset and their behaviors in their early to late 70s, or mid to late 70s, which is the age of my parents and my in-laws, it's much different. It's much different. And when you start to see the real big wave of boomers, it'll be even more different. And part of that, thankfully, are advances in medical technology that's allowing us to live longer. Part of that is an awareness of the importance of exercise and social connection, which we'll get to in a second. But even a mindset difference, which I think is so important with some of the stories that you shared, because some cases, and I'm sure you've talked about this in the past, but we become victims of ageism to ourselves.
Oh, definitely.
And so one of the first pieces, I believe, in any successful strategy around aging well, it starts with having a vision of what you ideally want these future chapters to look like, and not be ageist against yourself. There's something called the U-shaped happiness curve, which I've written a little bit about. I have a monthly blog on the Smart Living 360 website. And one of them a year or so ago was on this U-shaped happiness curve. And it's something to keep in mind, because it says that there's a certain happiness level you have in your 20s. And then you kind of go in a negative slope for a number of years. And actually, this curve is a global phenomenon, not just a U.S. phenomenon. And so you go down this curve, and then in your kind of mid to late 40s, early 50s, that you hit this low point in self-reported well-being. Pretty much where I am right now. I like to link of it a bit to having teenagers.
Having teenagers is always a factor. Yeah.
Curveballs. And then it picks up again. In fact, your self-reported well-being or happiness is higher in aggregate for people in their 70s and 80s than it was at any other period in their lifetime. So in fact, in some ways we call it the U-shaped happiness curve, but that's not exactly true, because there's a bit more of a spike on the backside. And so this narrative that we get sometimes in our popular culture around being older, not necessarily being as cool or people fearing, is not consistent with some of the academic research that's out there. And the reason I share that is because when we think about place, I think it's really significant to understand how place supports your vision of what you want to focus on in these extra chapters of life. So getting back to your latter question, I wrote this book recently, Right Place, Right Time: The Ultimate Guide to Choosing a Home for the Second Half of Life. Exactly. There you go. Thank you, Wendy. And that I had no plans of being an author, Wendy, but life circumstances and passion really got the better of me. And I've been, as you point out in the intro, I've been really fascinated with the role of place and healthy aging for the better part of 15, almost 20 years. And I've seen it. I've lived in a senior living community. I have had all sorts of different roles as an investor, as an executive for the largest companies in senior living, as a board member, a strategy consultant, a bunch of different roles. But what's happened was I kept getting questions, Wendy, where people were saying, well, Ryan, what should I do? How should I think about this? And I thought perhaps naively that if I put some ideas on paper, it would save me time. It turns out it takes a while to write a book, I learned, and edit a book actually. But what's happened has been really awesome because it's made me think a lot more deeply about like why place matters so much. And as you point out with the self-assessment, there are these key dimensions that we often don't necessarily directly associate with place,
Right.
but they have a very meaningful indirect effect. And so I believe that place is one of the most significant decisions you make in your life. And you're, in some respects, constantly making that decision because you are, I'll say every year, you're making a decision, whether you know it or not, to like stay in your current place or not. And
Right.
and that type of decision, as we'll get into, has real impact on your day-to-day life. Part of what I want to mention on the front end for your listeners is place. Like, what do we mean by place? Place seems sometimes to be a bit of a nebulous term. And what I mean by place is a few things. I mean, it's certainly the four walls of your home. Absolutely. But in some cases, that's what people think of in terms of place. And it's a lot more than that. So it's your four walls. It's your neighborhood that you live in. It is the metropolitan area that you're part of. Are you in an urban, rural, suburban setting? That helps have influence on how you think about place as this composite. What state, what region of the country, really what country? And, we see that a bit, sadly, right now with some of the global conflicts that are happening, of course, in Ukraine, but even what the circumstances in Afghanistan and what's happened with some of the changes there. So you might live in a perfect neighborhood and great four walls somewhere in Afghanistan, but odds are when you look at its composite, that's not a great place. And so it's sad, it's heartbreaking, the disruption that some of these conflicts have created. But when we think about our lives and how we think about place, we need to understand that these different this composite of place, not just your four walls, but your neighborhood and so on, and thinking about place more broadly.
Yeah, so let me ask you a little bit more about that, because a lot of times we have moved over our lifetimes for work, right? So it wasn't that we took a whole lot of thought about, am I going to like living in Georgia or Washington, D.C.? It's just like, oh, that's where the job is. That's where I'm going. But now we have an opportunity to think about where we might want to live. And one of the things you suggest is to try it out. So, say for instance, my kids are living in, Oregon, which they're not, but let's just imagine, like, how do I stop everything and spend a month or so in another place to figure out, is that going to fit for what I'm looking for?
Yeah, so it can be daunting, and let me share a little bit around these different elements of place, and then, or of why place matters in terms of social connection and so on. And then, like you point out, well, it can be daunting. So how do you break it into smaller pieces? And when you shared with me that you'd study computer science, I think, and I'd studied electrical engineering in college. My kids make fun of me. They're like, "Dad, that has nothing to do with what you're doing now." And
I know, right?
but I tend to push back a little bit, because I do think that there are elements of like systems thinking engineering teaches you that has applicability for life more broadly, including things like this and how we break down how to make good decisions about place. But one quick thing, and then I'll answer your question directly, and that is place, where we live has a direct influence of how our lives are, simply because there are emotional ties to place. There are physical dimensions that, in some case, restrictions that we may have, that if our place doesn't fit, it triggers a need for a new place. But a key thing is to understand that where you live has influence around helping you find purpose at each stage of life, and it helps you find opportunities for social connection. It helps you find, it can nudge you towards being more physically active. It can also, given the theme, I think, of the content this month, Wendy, it has a very meaningful impact on your financial well-being, depending on how you think about that. So you've got these indirect things which we can spend a little more time on as our conversation evolves. But as you get into it, as you think about, well, I might have ideas of what I think my right place for me, but I think a key piece, and I go into this in some detail in the book, is I think there's some wisdom in applying design thinking, which is a term that's been popularized really through the corporate world in universities, but it's pretty simple. It's basically, and in those contexts, it's often around how a way to think about innovation. But it's pretty simple. It's really just saying, you apply the scientific method, you've got a hypothesis that you believe, and then you test it. And so you test it, you learn, you find out whether your hypothesis was right or not, and you then tweak it. In most cases, you find out that there was something false, wrong in your hypothesis, and you then tweak it, try a new experiment and see what you learn. And what does that look like? Well, going back to your example, Wendy, with hypothetical one where you have family in Oregon and you live in South Carolina, like that, any move at any age is a big move.
It's difficult.
It takes courage. It takes vision. It takes fortitude, risk. You have to have some level of risk aversion, but we'll come back to later on, I'm sure, the fact that it's risky to do nothing. And so one of the things about it, as you get into it, it's like, well, how can I find ways, like I mentioned, in terms of design thinking, are there ways that I can test out something that I think might be true before I have to make a full big commitment to it? And so one example, and a lot of it's logical, but sometimes people skip steps along the way, is if you have, if you said you have family or kids in Oregon, well, one way to do it would be to go out there and visit, but not just for a couple of days at a time,
right?
Maybe weeks, maybe a month or so. Maybe there's an opportunity to do an Airbnb where you're not necessarily living with family there, but maybe near, but you can get some sense of what would life look like in your own, place in that environment. Because something to be aware of too is this meaningful significance of your social network. So if your friends are obese, you're more likely to obese. It's again your friends, not just your friends, but your friends. It's just the power of these cultures. And on the other hand, like if your friends are fit and more active, then you're going to have some influence there. This particular example, Oregon tends to be pockets of it anyway, pretty active place, and, a lot of hiking and things like that. So you can get caught up in a good way in some of those cultural elements. But the idea is like, how can you have different ways to test what you're looking to do in a thoughtful way before you decide to leave completely from your current home, to a new place. This type of thinking around design thinking tends to be particularly important when they're big, irreversible decisions.
Yeah,
And
and it's tough, because besides the cost of it, right? So you're still maintaining your own home, and now you're out renting for a month. But now you also have to think about, like you said, the social connections. You have to make a plan if you're going to try and meet people there. What about the purpose? Or, what ways can you get involved? There's a lot to take into consideration.
yeah, and there is, and it's not, I advocate for a pretty holistic way of thinking about it. In part because with people living longer, going back to our age of longevity construct, which researchers say today that babies born today in the developing world, the modern economies, modern countries, that they have a 50% chance of living to at least 200.
Right.
So this idea of like living to 100 is going to become less and less like an outlier. And so that means if you quote unquote retire, which, I know we both, unretire is a better word,
Right.
but I think if that's 65 and you might live to 100, that's another 35 years. And so what do you want those chapters to look like? And where do you find purpose in each one is really, significant. And there's a lot of research I can quote on that. So I think it means that you do want to have a set of questions when you're exploring these places, not saying that any one place is going to check every box you could possibly imagine. And some areas are more important, to some individuals than others. But recognizing it's more than just your four walls as you get into it. In some cases, you could have situations, depending where you're from, you could rent your house while or Airbnb your house while you go to another place. And there could be some ways there to make it so it's less of a financial loss, let's say, than it could be otherwise. So it requires kind of creativity on both sides of this. But I think it is helpful to say here are the things that matter to me. Here are the things that here are things that matter to me. And here are things that from a research perspective, also really, I know to make a difference. How well is that aligned with my current place and future places?
Right. And I think that goes back to your whole discussion about vision. You have to have a vision for what it is that you're looking for, and probably do some research before you even go. So you're going to have an idea of where to find it. But I wanted to talk about now not moving, like the whole idea of aging in place. And you kind of redefined that. You called it living in community. So I really like that. Would you talk about that?
Yeah. So I don't go on many rants in the book, but I do go a bit of a rant on aging in place, and they're for a few different reasons. I take issues with the branding of aging in place, because aging seems like it's something that's happening to you as opposed to being an agent in your own path. And so and then in place, it seems like you're like a statue. You're immobile. And so I have issues with that as well. And so this idea of being a statue in one place where things are just happening to you is really at odds with the research around healthy aging and longevity. It's quite frankly, it's the opposite. It says it's more about living than necessarily aging. It's more about leaning into these different experiences that are possible. It connotes action and movement around. In fact, it was part of a conference several years ago where we had the foremost region surgeon generals, and they asked them to provide advice for successful aging in one word, and all of them independently came up with the word move as being like, that's what you just got to move every day. So I do. So I take issues, first of all, with the language, but I also take issue a bit with the strategy in the sense that I think the strategy of aging in place, while popular, is much more challenging than many people realize or care to admit. And that's one of the reasons I created the self-assessment tool, because it helps you take a moment to say, well, if I really were to look at my place today across this broader lens, do I have purpose the way that I could? Am I as socially connected as I could be? Most older adults today, about 50% of older adults today don't know any of their neighbors. It's crazy. And so this idea of your place being an opportunity to get to know those around you, it's those strong or loose ties, they make a difference. And so on. So I think that I listen, I have, and we have an emotional connection, many of us do, to our home. And that's something to be celebrated. We moved from the Baltimore area to Austin about 3 years ago, and Baltimore was home and it was hard to leave. And we're in the midst of creating that sense of home here in Austin, and we're making good progress on that. So it's not easy, but I think being able to really kind of recognize that that address, perhaps you've had for many years, maybe decades, that has served you well in certain chapters in life, may not be the right address for these future chapters. And so at least acknowledging that there's the possibility that there's a better path driven by a different place is, I think, really important in people's thinking. I suggest living in community, as you mentioned, because it is more active. It is, which I think is critical, as I mentioned earlier, but also in community. This idea that successful aging, it's not a solo sport. We've got to find ways where, even if we have spouses or partners, like you need a broader group of people, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, to help be part of other people's lives, but also your own as it evolves. And so what that also allows you to do is to say, hey, in my context, we love Austin, but maybe, and we love our neighborhood, but maybe in time, the right solution is not to leave Austin, but maybe it's to move to a different neighborhood, a different physical dwelling. And that allows me to still live in community, but not necessarily age in place. Where we were earlier. I know some others have suggested the term kind of age in the right place, which I think is also a better term than what we have that's been more popularized with aging in place. But so I really have issues with both the term as well as I just think it's far more complicated than people realize.
Yeah, and I like the spin you put on it, that aging is, people see it as a disease almost. It's something that happens to you.
Right.
So by changing that terminology is good. We have a comment here that aging in your home is not just about putting grab bars in the shower. So I think that's true. And then there was a question also about you're talking about movement, right? So if we are trying to stay active, successfully age in a healthy way, but movement is a challenge, I think finding the right place also is really important for
It
that.
probably becomes even more important. So I'll give you some examples. There's situations where, on a simple example, there are some places where people live where you can just walk outside your door, and maybe and you're in either a walkable place to do errands and live life, or it's a suburban area and it's where there's sidewalks. And it's easy to get around. So you've effectively lowered the barrier to just be active. And when I say move, it's just move. On the other hand, for those that might have other physical impairments, there are buildings I'm familiar with, communities where it's all enclosed but very walkable. So you can have the ability to to move different parts of, I know some retirement communities that have this, where they have little bridges and ways for people to walk if you want, many miles throughout the day, if you so desire. So I think first of all, it's a mindset. And then second of all, it's just trying to find a place that meets you kind of where you are in that chapter of life.
Yeah, and I think it's also like in some of the retirement communities that have pools and that have, exercise. So even if you're wheelchair bound, you can still find ways to have motion, which is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of pieces that are important, and this is certainly one of them. And in fact, I'm in my mid to late 40s, and we've got I added some weights in our garage. Part of the pandemic, changes. And when it relates to strength training and bone density, it's actually more important to lift weights when you're older than when you're younger. And so that's part of this idea of recognizing like these different life chapters. How do you do what's best for the stage that you're in?
There was something that you brought up in your book that I thought was really interesting, that you said loneliness seems to be most prevalent in older adults and college students.
Yeah.
And that finding purpose seems to be more difficult for older adults and college students. And it was interesting. And I wonder if there are experiments or ways to kind of bring those together to work on both of those issues.
Yeah, we're at a really interesting time in our society because, people refer to it as, I'm sure many of your listeners have seen, just a loneliness epidemic. And this was true before the pandemic. Pandemic certainly made it worse, but it's also put just a spotlight on it. And it's really concerning. It's really concerning. And those of you that are in the field of social work or certain psychology, health services, there's just a lot of demand, sadly, here. And so what that means is our society has made it harder just to connect with people in a very personal way. Social media, there's a lot of good with social media, but I think there's also some pieces that have pulled people apart. And so I think, and that's particularly a challenge for, younger adults, I would say, that digital natives, where they're, not used to what society used to be, to just knock on your door and meet, more comfortable with meeting people in person. But with the older adult thing, it's true too. I think part of it, like we've been talking about, is really leaning into the advantages and opportunities of these additional chapters. And so there are, Wendy, there are situations where some pretty clever things that are being tried right now around intergenerational living.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, there's a group called encore.org, which has been, I was a fellow for an op-ed project they helped launch. Yeah. And part of what's great about Encore is they're shifting. Initially, it was about how can we create more of a narrative around second acts and particularly for the social good. It's evolved a little bit more now to really encourage intergenerational, gen to gen opportunities, and place matters in that. So I helped develop a community in the DC area where we built an apartment building, but thought about all ages as part of it. It's called the Stories at Congressional Plaza. We got some national attention around it. So we incorporate elements of universal design. And then in that process, what we did is so it was like wider doorways, but no one really noticed. Bathrooms with showers, slip resistant tiles, a bunch of things that really older people take a look at and check the box as something that's important, but it was just attractive. Mm-hmm. And we did some very intentional things to bring people together in different activities and just ways for people to get to know their neighbor. So you have examples of what I would describe as age-friendly apartment buildings and other dwellings. You're seeing some opportunities now where people can, through some tools now, they can better screen for roommates that are of different ages. You're seeing some communities, mixed use communities, where you're building multiple types of apartments or condos that are, some may be age restricted, others aren't, but allows for a day-to-day interaction, that happens. And I think this is really important. In fact, you're seeing some examples where some retirement communities are encouraging younger people to even live within the retirement community. There's been some examples of that. So there, I think it really is, when you look at the research around intergenerational activity or relationship, it's important for both sides. And so I would encourage your listeners here, if that's something that you're drawn to, I have some suggestions in the book, but just be curious about it. Do some research, see what might be possible in your area. One of the challenges sometimes with a traditional retirement community is, by definition, it's age restricted. And so it can be harder to just have that day-to-day interaction that is more common.
Well, I was really interested to read about some of these things. I'm got your book open now about the home sharing and the co-housing and the co-living and intergenerational living communities, because I think that is super important. And I'm wondering, with your background in real estate, do you see any that seem to really be catching on, that seem to be, that's a good direction we're heading in?
Yeah, I think we're at an exciting stage because I've used the pejorative term kind of shady acres for the traditional retirement communities. And I think you're getting more and more pressure on shady acres, that this idea of retire, which, by the way, retire means to withdraw, to disappear. I know during the baseball season, I was watching a game, just a fraction of a game, and the announcer said, the batter, hit the ball to left field, and the outfielder caught it. The batter is now retired. They're off the screen. They're off the place there. And so I think we've got an awful term to describe what really should be not retire from, but what are you going to retire to? What's your next act, next chapter? And so I think there's a key piece, which is happening in an exciting way. I think real estate developers are recognizing we got to think differently about how we support people and empower them around these new chapters. So I would describe we're in an experiment phase right now, where people are building what we've had traditionally, but there's a new crop of innovations that are happening. They're small scale. They're not across the country. They're in different areas, but we can start to see what models people are responding to that will ultimately lead to more of that. And I think there's a key role here that individuals have, which is to be vocal about what you're looking for, even through channels like Hey Boomer, which is actually one of the reasons I decided to write this book, is really wanted to help people as they navigate what I think, as I said earlier, is one of the most important decisions in life that you make a number of times in your life, but also to be more informed around, well, here's what people value, to then, help the real estate development world create better options for people, better aligned with the psychographics of tomorrow. In fact, I'm doing a keynote talk at the Urban Land Institute, ULI, which is really the largest real estate developer network in the country, really globally, around these topics. So I would say, there is co-housing and there are co-living and a number of newer models. It's hard to say right now, Wendy, that there's any one in particular that is, taking off in large scale. But I would expect to see a number of those that do get traction to be more available across the country.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about the idea of intergenerational living, because I think it serves the purpose of grandparents can have a sense of purpose with children that live nearby by, helping out, and the young people can be there to help us should we need some assistance. And I just think it's a brilliant, certainly, way to look to the future. And so boomers, all of you out there listening, Ryan said, be vocal. So let's let it be known that that's something that appeals to us, instead of just being kind of shut away into everybody's over 65 and this is where they have to live now.
Well, and part of that is, to play devil's advocate for a moment, the most successful master development in the country is the villages. And the villages is very clear. We are age restricted and we're about this type of lifestyle. And so there are, there are people that have different preferences. And so
Sure.
that's, I think, part of this. There's no one thing that fits everyone. And I see a note here, a comment from Susan, and she's right. I think we have to not be naive, in terms of people do need to live peacefully together. And so I think in some cases, the most elegant solutions are ones where you offer housing like I've described in I would call age-friendly housing to make it work for people of all ages, but also have, particularly when you look at retirement housing that has some level of health care that may be part of it, have places like that do focus on things that are needs that are more applicable for older people, but have them located in such a way that allows for spontaneous interaction with people beyond just the demographic of your building. And some of that you see in urban settings, some of it can be suburban settings. We can do better in that regard. But I think expecting everyone to want to live, under the same roof, that can be challenging for other reasons too. Not the least of which is noise and different sleeping patterns.
Right. Well, I kind of want to talk about the one thing that we haven't talked about, and that is the planning for when we really do need help. And it's something that none of us want to imagine, that suddenly we're sick or we've hurt ourselves, we need to go into some kind of rehab, and our kids go, all right, here you go. And we haven't had a chance to think about it. So what are some strategies you suggest for looking ahead and having some ideas to be prepared if and when that time comes up?
Yeah, so this is a lot of the content at Smart Living 360 and the book Right Place, Right Time is focused on planners, and I believe that place matters in many ways profoundly at any stage in our lifespan. But I think for this, some of that thinking can happen as early as your mid 40s for some advanced planners because of, again, how we think about place. When we focus a bit more, I would say, on some of the health concerns that might become more prevalent in our mid 70s and beyond, I think one of the first steps is getting some feel for, your unique circumstances. When we think about place, I know in the relationship with my wife, she doesn't agree with everything I have to say. And vice versa. So yes, I know. So, what you're looking for may not be exactly what your partner's looking for. And so there's really important conversations in that. I think that you have to have, on the other hand, if you're, a solo ager, someone that doesn't necessarily have family close by or doesn't have kids, like there may be a greater responsibility to have a plan in place. And so I think that as you think about that particular, kind of life stage where either there are some health needs or they could be around the corner, I think it's a key time to be thinking about doing some research on what are the options. One of the concerns I have with people, if you do decide to move to more of a senior living type location, that can be disruptive, just like any move. And so in some cases, if people live in a certain location for a while, and then there's an acute health need that requires a change, you might move to a new environment, and you may have a hard time building a community in that new environment.
Right.
And so in some cases, there can be wisdom to moving to a place that has a plan for you in advance, where you have a chance to get to know friends there, build more of a community around where you are. But there's a wide range of options I talk about in the book. But in general, I think in much of this, it's an opportunity for seeing the good that comes with a longer life and the key role that place has. But you don't want to be naive to the fact that life has ups and downs, and being prepared for that. And this is one of the reasons to pick on aging in place one more time. It's like, if there are plans to age in place and it turns out they're just not in the right place, then if something happens, it can be really disruptive.
Right.
And you lose control and opportunities to do it, the way you want, which is a comment here right
Yeah.
on. So that's and ideally, you just want to make some of these decisions when they're not urgent.
Well, Ryan, your book, Right Place, Right Time, really did give me a lot to think about. And it's an easy read. I like the way you broke it up. I like the way you focused on purpose and social connection and physical activity, all of that, with place being the foundation. But I always like to ask my guest if there's one or two takeaways you'd like to leave with the audience. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, thank you. As I said, it's been hard but fun in this process of writing the book and sharing with people. And it's been really rewarding because I think part of what I've seen is that a lot of people, myself included, before I started really spending time on this, I didn't give place the respect that it deserves in the context of really driving, optimizing the chances of a healthy, financially secure, long life. And so I would say that the first thing for your, viewers and listeners is just place matters a lot, and choose wisely. Really give it the time it deserves, the energy it deserves, to make sure that you're in the right place for the chapter that you're in. And the fact is, many of us, God willing, will have a number of chapters. And just being comfortable and engaging, ideally with friends and family, to talk it through, of how to think about it. So that's one thing. Just give it a respect and recognize it's an investment worth pursuing. If you care enough to watch what you eat and exercise, place should be in that same level of discussion. And then I also, like we've said earlier, just encourage people to create that opportunity for self-reflection. And when I wrote the book, I got a lot of positive feedback on these dashboards that are part of it, where you get to see other people's stories, and then you get to think about and reflect on yours in those 5 areas of purpose, social connection, physical being, financial well-being, and then just place itself. And encourage those that do want to think more about this to take the self-assessment on the website, and then feel free to reach out to me. I'm in the process now of trying to figure out, given the success of the book, what's other content that I can provide that would be helpful for people on this journey. With my my vision is to really be seen as an objective expert, international expert on this role of place and healthy aging, and giving people some of the tools to navigate, on that journey. So do engage in the assessment if that's right for you, and look out for, for other things. But I do, just thanks for the email there, Wendy, because do reach out. I'm trying to create stuff that would really be effective and valuable for people on their journey.
Yeah. So thank you, Ryan. You've been a very, very good guest, and an important topic. Like he said, if you want to reach out to him, it's Ryan, RYAN, at smartliving360.com, and go to the website, smartliving360.com, to take the self-assessment. I think you'll get some interesting insights from that. So the final part of our series on our relationship with financial security as we age, we're going to talk to a woman named Frances Simon about senior elder abuse. So each guest in the series up to now has given us knowledge to help us become more proactive in our preparation for our best future. Frances is going to talk to us about becoming aware of warning signs, the red flags, what we can do to protect ourselves and our loved ones from elder financial abuse. So I hope that these topics have been useful, will continue to be useful. If you have questions, if you want more information, you can certainly email me at wendy@heyboomer.biz. I can put you in touch with some of the right folks. And we can also consider having a Hey Boomer dialogue every once in a while, just on a Zoom thing, to talk about some of these questions that come up because of what we've talked about in our shows. And if you like what we're doing on Hey Boomer, you can support us with the buymeacoffee.com/HeyBoomer0413, which is when our first show was. April 13th. So buymeacoffee.com/heyboomer0413 to help support the work that I'm doing here. And I just want to thank you all for tuning in today. I know that your time is valuable, and every time we put on a show, I hope this is valuable to you as well. And I'd like to remind you to live with passion, live with relevance, live with courage, and we are never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. My name is Wendy Green, and this has been